Graben and Jamie Flinchball are two guys drinking whiskey while chatting about lean ideas, experiences, and news. Let's hope they hold their liquor because they're not holding back on sharing their opinions. It's time for Lean Whiskey, Lean Talk with a Fun Spirit.
Welcome to episode 33 of Lean Whiskey. This is our back to normal, but not really episode. This is Jamie Flinchball here with Mark Graben. And, some things are back to normal, but there's no video this time, but we are doing our first ever in-person podcast.
Hey, Jamie. I'm looking across the table at Jamie instead of looking through Zoom.
It's a little weird, but in the end, this is where it started, right? This was, you and me going out for a whiskey and talking shop and then saying, hey, why don't we record this?
We should have recorded that.
Right. And so this is sort of full circle. It's where we started. So, So we're taking advantage of the opportunity that you're nearby in Philadelphia on the road again.
That's the one sort of back to normal. I started back on the road consulting 2 weeks a month in February. I've been coming here to Philadelphia, and you live, how far away?
It depends on what time of day it is, so anywhere from an hour and 15 to 2 hours. As Philadelphia, as there's only so many ways to get in and out of Philadelphia.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you made it here, and I was remembering, I was about to say, I've never done a podcast in person together with somebody, but then it occurred to me, the one time I actually held a little recorder in front of somebody in person was Stephen Covey, Stephen Covey at a Shingo conference.
Wow.
When the Shingo Institute arranged the opportunity for me to talk with him. And it was pre-iPhone, so I had like a separate little recorder.
Hand recorder, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember, I had a hand recorder. I had a tape one. And I had a digital one, and I can't remember, I think I just used them for voice notes, but
recording lectures in college?
I don't know. I don't think I did that because I'm not a very good auditory learner. So I don't think that would have worked for me anyway. So I think it was just for myself to make, usually while driving, I'm guessing, make some audio notes, which interestingly I don't do anymore, even with as easy as it is with a phone.
Yeah.
But so first in person, which also makes it easier to do some other things like share some whiskey, and we'll come to that in a bit. But so how far Philly's, I'll say an hour and a half. We'll just average it out for me. So how far did you have to come to get here?
It was about an hour and a half flight from Cincinnati, and that's a new departure spot for me.
Yep. So that's new since our last episode of Lean Whiskey, and you're always a man of two cities.
Yeah. When we started the podcast, it was Orlando and DFW.
Yep.
And then it shifted just over 2 years ago to being DFW and Los Angeles. So it was for my wife's job, and then she just recently started a new job, new company, great opportunity for her, based in Cincinnati. So we're still in the midst of relocating. So on the road has its meaning from that. Like we drove across 4 different days from first off Los Angeles to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and then from the Dallas area to Cincinnati. So we had a lot of time in the car listening to the podcast. We actually listened to Art Burns' audiobook. A lot of our listeners might know his book on lean enterprise, lean transformation. I forget the exact name, but it wasn't Art Burns' voice. It was the narrator. But so we listened to that. We talked about that. It's related to her work and company too. It was recommended to her. So there we were, driving along, listening and talking lean.
Nice. Well,
or bad, or nice, awful. No, it was nice.
Yeah, my wife does not talk lean stuff with me, and I still pick on her because she hasn't even read my new book. She argues she read my old book like 3 times as she was one of my many editors, so she doesn't have to read the new one. So
and she's probably good at solving problems. One of those people who solve problems.
The ones she wants to, at least. So
that's a book plug. Jamie's new book is titled "People Solve Problems."
People Solve Problems.
And hopefully your wife doesn't consider you a problem.
Well, yeah. So that's probably why it's easy for me to get out of the house and come down to Philadelphia. So, we always have to plan. When we plan these episodes, we have to think about where's Mark going to be and what whiskeys do you have,
What do you have with
in
you?
which location while we pick a theme. But now, being in Kentucky, we could just kind of say, go out and get some whiskey.
It's going to be easier. Yeah, so we're actually going to be living across the river in Kentucky. So excited about that. Hour and a half from Louisville. We'll call it an hour and a half from Lexington, and so then all the distilleries, points in between, are about that same distance, including our friend who we've talked about before, David Meyer, his distillery,
The true lean whiskey.
Glens Creek Distilling. So I'm looking forward to hanging out with him more. There's a distillery on the very northern side of Kentucky, right before the river, New Riff Distillery.
Which I've only recently had and I really enjoyed.
Yeah, so
Good
I'm going to check that out. And then there's even smaller micro distilleries, even on the Ohio side, in Cincinnati. But I've already heard the recommendations of there's a certain liquor store with a tasting bar in the Kentucky side that specializes in old, dusty bottles.
Okay.
And you can go and do flights of some of these older whiskeys. I mean, I'm sure it's not cheap. And there's actually a really nice whiskey bourbon tasting bar in the Cincinnati airport. So you can go and have a sip. They'll put it in a plastic glass if you want to take your tasting to the gate. And if you're on the way home or even past security, next time coming here, if we're going to meet up again, I could buy a bottle past security and then bring it to you. But being that it was going to be a flight here anyway, that was, I hate checking a bag, but I'll do it for whiskey. So that's what we're going to be able to taste something together today from a bottle that I brought.
Yeah. So we're gonna do our first ever tasting of this whiskey, which is fun, and also do a little side by side, but the same whiskey in two different glasses.
So what I brought today is something we've talked about before. It was episode 29. It was sort of like the ill-fated barrel from Garrison Brothers, and we have tasted and talked about Garrison Brothers before. It would be great to meet up with you there someday. Maybe it's more likely we can meet up in Kentucky and
Probably more likely,
do
yes.
another episode in person there. That's driving distance, but I'm not going to recap the whole sordid, awful mishap story. People can go back to episode 29 and listen to it, but. My attempt at a long story short was this was a barrel that my wife and I had filled in September of 2015, and we were going 2014, and we were going to let it age, and we were going to buy. We had the option of buying the contents of said barrel, and there was a mishap. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but the master distiller dropped another larger barrel on ours, and it was crushed, and it was smashed, and all the liquid spilled out into the floor. So we had the opportunity to buy the barrel that was filled right before ours and aged right next to it. And so our custom label here, and I'm gifting what we don't drink during the episode. I'm gifting this to Jamie.
There'll be plenty left.
This is our Garrison Brothers Texas Straight Bourbon Whiskey, cask strength, single barrel. We've named it One Off because it is a one-off whiskey. Once the 60 bottles from this barrel are gone, it'll never exist again. It's one off in the barrel number, and we're going to taste it. And 61.35% alcohol at that cask strength.
Yeah, that's pretty some strong stuff. But it's it's an interesting story because we've talked about this before, I know, but the idea of you value add in whiskey, right? And you kind of go, well, inventory isn't value add, but if it's aging and improving in the barrel,
it's changing. Yeah,
it is value add, and it's a multi-year value add.
So whiskey makers, if they're good about it, they have to be patient.
Yep.
More so in Scotland, the aging is accelerated. In the U.S., even more so in Texas. But I'll plug one of my other podcasts, My Favorite Mistake. Donis Todd, the master distiller, told a story there of how he actually did overage some whiskeys. So it's value adding until it hits a point now where it becomes defective. And he missed that sweet spot, and that was one of his mistakes. But he learned from it, and he didn't get fired, so all's good, I guess.
All's good. But Yeah, that patience and the speciality of it, and that's why you ended up with one off versus doing the whole process again, right? But
Yeah, we didn't want to wait another 7 years.
no, but it kind of reminds me of that freighter that came across from Europe with all the Lamborghinis, and
Yeah.
you probably custom ordered your car, you spent a boatload of money on it, you're waiting for it forever, and it's on its way, and the ship burns.
Yeah.
Now you got to kind of go, am I going to wait that whole thing again, or am I just going to buy something off the lot?
Well, I heard a story about some authors. I think the one in particular was a cookbook author who had, and I'm surprised that they were printing books in Europe and shipping them across to the US on a boat. On that same boat, it was like the entire print run of some celebrity chefs, I forget the name, full color, gorgeous, maybe it's specialty printing, I don't know, but it all ended up lost at sea. And the lead times on all of that printing were going to mean a delay getting that book to market. So
Yeah,
felt
I guess-
bad for that author.
I'm not sure it's more or less wasteful to split your batch into two and put it on two different ships, or
It's a risk mitigation.
print on demand
Strategy.
as I do today. But yeah, I know we don't spend a lot of time talking about the whiskeys, but this has a lot of richness of flavor, sort of caramel and banana, I think. I'm not really good at tasting
Yeah, I
notes.
don't know if I get banana, but Garrison Brothers always has a lot of like caramel and butterscotch.
Yep.
It's a really deep orangey, almost even reddish color. I can't come up with tasting notes, but I don't think I told the story before. When I finally got the bottles, I gave one to a friend of mine who's part of a bourbon tasting group in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And even though they're all from Texas, and my friend Doug has been down to Garrison Brothers with me, and he loves their different releases. A lot of his friends, even though they're Texans through and through, a lot of them have a bias against Texas whiskey. Like they are into Kentucky bourbon. And so he brought a bottle of this release, and he blind tasted it for them. And he asked them to guess, and they're fairly sophisticated. What do you think it is? And they guessed first off that it was Kentucky bourbon. Wrong. He had them guess the mash bill, and they thought, well, it's spicy. It must be a high rye bourbon. Right. Wrong. It's actually a wheated bourbon.
Right.
It is spicy. I think that must come from the barrel.
Yep.
And then they guessed, like, oh, it must be a bottled in bond. It's probably 50% ABV. Wrong. It's actually 62, and they liked it. So I guess it goes to show, maybe be open-minded if you are generalizing and say, I don't like Texas whiskey. There are some that I don't like.
Yeah. Well, and Texas whiskey, because of the heat, right? It does do something different in the barrel than a Kentucky climate.
Or Scotch. Yeah.
Or Scotch, certainly. And so that has an effect, but you don't want to just assume that that's the only variable, right?
Yeah.
There's the control the master distiller takes. There's the ingredients. There's so many other factors that again, our friend David Meyer is like,
right.
Hey, don't just think aging is the main factor. There's so much more to it.
Yeah.
Including grain selection.
Well, there are many variables, and the difference between the two one-off barrels, the two barrel numbers, it was basically the same distillate put into different barrels, aged side by side, and the barrel that we had tasted before it got destroyed was a much lighter, more delicate whiskey. It was almost out of character. First, Garrison Brothers, it might be the type of thing you blend
right
in with other barrels, and then this one came out more that typical style, if not really surprisingly spicy. So I've got to think that's the variation in the barrels.
Yeah, I'd imagine so, and I do know that, and this probably wasn't the case here because it's not that big an operation, but the multi-story rick houses where the top floor is going to get a different heat profile than the bottom floor can really change a barrel. But how the air flows through the room, what that does to the micro temperatures, and how much you knock a barrel and it sloshes around, all sorts of factors. But the barrel is an imprecise process as well. I don't think anybody's done a study of, well, this tree grew in the northern side of the forest and created these kind of staves.
There's the wood variation. There's how much it's charred, And I mean, the podcast here is not Six Sigma whiskey. I'm going to argue not all variation is bad.
Right. No, and I think that's the fun thing. The fun thing about whiskey in general is the variation. The same thing is true of wine, and even when you get single barrels like this, you can taste the differences from barrel to barrel, and that's interesting.
Yeah, some people really prize that.
Yeah, and that's why blending, blending was more about hiding bad barrels.
It could be
for a long time. Now it's not. Now it's about maintaining a consistency by blending your way to the mean.
I would be curious if you had a distiller who would speak honestly about this. I didn't mean to say there are dishonest distillers, but yeah, I mean, if you've got something that on its own doesn't match your brand or is slightly off, I bet you could hide that in a batched blend.
Yeah, I would think so. But I can see how the blind tasters thought this was a rye. You definitely get more spice than a typical wheated bourbon.
If not a rye, a high rye bourbon mash bill. It's not overly, it's not super corny sweet. So I could see where someone might think it was actually mostly rye.
Yeah, that's exactly. So yeah, it's not super sweet, but again, it's got that candy caramel on it. So
yeah. But then we're doing this comparison where we've tasted two different whiskeys side by side before. Mm-hmm. Here we've got the same whiskey in two different glasses. So I have from the hotel. It's basically a stemless wine glass. It's a reasonably decent glass.
For hotel glasses, this is probably as good as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, I would drink wine out of this. It's a fairly thin. It's not super delicate. It's not a Riedel special, but it's reasonably good. And then speaking of Riedel, Jamie brought some glasses along. I'm tasting alongside. This is what they call it, the Riedel
sommelier or somm
glass,
tasting glass, and I've got a Norland tasting glass. So
you've used that before. I haven't seen it in person.
Yeah, I've used this before. It's engineered to sort of separate the bad alcohol emittance from the aroma, and so you're supposed to get more of that. So really, the comparison is: does the same whiskey in two different glasses make a difference?
Yeah, and the Riedel glass, because we're not on video and people can't see it. It's very similar to a Glencairn glass, but instead of the top curving in toward the middle, it actually curves out like a flower.
Yeah.
So it's actually wider at the top, and like my understanding of glasses like this, they're trying to somehow deposit the liquid on a particular part of your tongue is one thing they do even with wine glasses with the shape and what have you.
It's that usually plus the nature of the aroma and how it interacts with your nose. So, but I generally trust Riedel to do things pretty well.
Yeah, it's a high quality. It's a pretty delicate glass.
It's very delicate.
I'm glad it made it here.
A little worried it might not make it. But it's interesting just comparing the glasses. The hotel glass, because I've traveled by car some lately, and if I travel by car, I can bring a bottle with me. Yeah. Do I bring a glass with me too? Is sort of a question.
Yeah.
And I think there's nothing wrong with whiskey out of this, I'll say non-whiskey glass. Yeah. But it's not as good.
I mean, it's not a classic tumbler. I think it's better drinking it out of this pseudo wine glass maybe. But I would travel with a glass. Those Glencairn glasses are not quite as thin and delicate as this. I would make sure it was bubble wrapped, probably.
I'm not
I'd
sure.
Probably throw it in my backpack instead of the suitcase.
Yep. And I've broken one of these Norland glasses because they will chip. Well, you got to drop it, but but I have to say, I think there's two aspects of it. I do think the taste and the nose is improved in a better glass.
Yeah.
And so I definitely feel, especially the nose, I think. But there's also the feel of it, right? Just sort of the act of drinking out of a proper glass is, to me, part of the experience.
Yeah, I mean the diameter of the top of the glass is about the same, but this Riedel has more of that curve outward. I'll call it convex, where the top of this wine glass is kind of concave. So it's probably I'm not neither. We're not doing the podcast for tasting notes sake or for tasting notes listeners, but to me there's a little bit less pronounced oak. Maybe it's just after some sips I've gotten accustomed to it out of the other glass.
It could be, but I do think, for me, it sort of mellows out a little bit without losing any of the flavor. I think that's mostly in the nose.
Yeah.
But as unscientific as this experiment was, the glass matters.
I'm going to continue the experiment. I may consolidate it into a single glass for simplicity here, but I'm going to give it my overly simplistic. Smells good, tastes good.
Smells good, tastes good, and I'll drink this out of a plastic cup if that's what you had handy. So
I've been guilty of that. I mean, I would do that too if need be. Yeah.
Yep. So all right, well, there's our fun whiskey of the day. So
thank you, Garrison Brothers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and thank you, Mark, for my my bottle here. That as we say, with whiskey, it's always more fun with friends. So I'm glad I don't just have a bottle of your whiskey, that we get to actually open it and drink it together.
Yeah.
So
cheers.
Cheers.
All right, so we've done the whiskey part of lean whiskey. I guess we'll do the lean.
Do the lean part. Yeah.
Part of lean whiskey. And I had a random thought the other day, because we've probably got people listening who fast forward through the whiskey part or don't care about the whiskey part. I was saying that maybe we'll take this segment and I might cut it out and publish it in the lean in my lean blog podcast as an experiment, just to see. We'll call it just the lean.
Just the lean
portion,
of lean whiskey.
or come up with some name, because I think we'll have a good discussion here based on an article, blog post Jamie wrote in 2015.
I think so. I think that's right. It's been a while, but it's been a constant thought of mine, and that is the topic of Lean 101 or Intro to Lean or whatever you want to call it. What should it exist? If so, what should it look like?
In what form?
What form, what content, etc. In a lot of ways, companies new to the journey in particular, but even mature in the journey, struggle with, what should we do? What's the right form? How do we get it out to the masses, so to speak? And I'm not sure I've ever been satisfied with many of the answers and examples.
I mean, you and I've certainly been tasked with doing some Lean 101 training. I'm sure you've done that too.
I have, but very little of it. I would generally, back in my older, I'll say consulting days, because I think that's different than what I do today.
Yeah.
We had lots of training. Training was a big part of what we did, but I would generally try to get out of us doing Lean 101. So, and I felt that for a couple of reasons. One is I didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
Why
is that?
I think it feels a little robotic, a little scripted, kind of because it should be.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of, I've always fed on the questions. I've always fed on the depth and the give me a challenging question. And I feel like you don't get as much of that richness in a Lean 101.
But I guess that's one variable of how do you conduct it.
Right.
Is it, not accusing you of this, or I hope I haven't done this, but the droning, one direction, PowerPoint heavy Lean 101 versus something that's much more discussion based.
Yes.
So there's variables. Like, is it an executive team? How many people are in the room? I would say with an executive team, we want to do something that's much more discussion based. Which topics do you choose? Do you have exercises? I mean, there's many variables where I'd say not all Lean 101 sessions are created equal, or there's so many different ways to do it.
So many different ways to do it, but I think, so one of the variables is also the who does it, and I've always felt pretty strongly that there's probably no decision point in Lean 101 that I'll hold to as religion, but I felt pretty strongly that the credibility of the instructor matters.
Yeah.
And for advanced topics, people are looking for the depth, right? They're looking for, I'm not going to say someone like you or I, but I mean, they're looking for the depth, and they're looking for the credibility that comes with perhaps years, if not decades, of study and practice and exploration. I feel with Lean 101, the credibility to the audience is more about an organizational statement than depth of lean knowledge. Because if whether it's a 1 hour or it's an 8 hour or something in between, you're probably not stretching the depth of knowledge very, very far. So, what credibility is more important to the listener? How much you know about lean, or how committed is the organization to this journey? And I would always argue it's usually the latter.
I mean, I could see people being disappointed if, let's say, on one extreme end of a bell curve, you've got standardized corporate slides, because let's say it's a large global enterprise. So to your point earlier, if not robotic, it needs to be consistent. You want everyone getting a same messaging. But if you've got somebody whose function is basically read slides to people, there's probably not a lot of value there. Otherwise, you could have just emailed the slides to people and said, here, read these. If you ask a question and someone's out of their depth and hasn't been properly prepared, or maybe it's just a matter of not having the experience, that might not be a really effective Lean 101.
It might not be. And I think, again, it's a matter of what questions do you want to answer. So this has always been an instructional design variable for me, where I often push back on people going through design. And they start with, what do we want people to hear? And I say, no. The question is, what do they need to hear? Right?
Sure. What do they need to accomplish?
What do they need to accomplish? What questions are in their head that you need to answer? Right? Those types of things is what are they asking? What do they feel like they need to know out of this topic for anything, really, is kind of my argument. So it's really a user-centered design variable around content than a deliverer-centered criteria. So I think that's pretty important. And then, regardless of how much time you have, you want to start with, where are they? Where are their heads at? Are they sort of on board with anything and they just need to know what it is? Or are you trying to overcome some natural resistance to past practices and past sins?
You've got to know a little bit of the history. You've got to know. We're trying to find out what people already know. So to those 2 points, if you're coming into a place where quote unquote lean's been given a bad name, I've seen this in healthcare where there was 1 year I got brought in like 3 organizations in a row, or I was on the heels. I'm not going to mention the consulting group, but after it was the same group, and the diagnosis or the explanation of the history was, lean's gotten a bad name here. Okay, well, why is that? Because lean was nothing but cost cutting. Oh boy! So now there's almost a need to try to. You have to help people unlearn. If it had been framed literally as just a list of cost cutting projects, I would say that missed the mark, and that's not really that's not at all what lean is. So then you need to understand that and try to help people if there's a recovery from that. But I also think of like on this consulting engagement here in Philadelphia, we've got some internal process improvement people we're working with, and even with a broader team we're working with, the other advisors from Value Capture and I, we haven't PowerPointed anybody. But I think even in one of those first discussions, I was trying to draw out, because I have a PI advisor who's already had some training, a little bit of experience. I'm trying to draw out, teach back to me what you know, and we're whiteboarding stuff. And this seems like you and your Windows tablet, Jamie, the way you might interact with people, whether it's in person or online. I'm like, what do you know? Let's have a conversation about that. Let me fill in some gaps. If they say something that's quote unquote wrong, maybe sort of, try to, in a gentle way. So, well, what I taught was, what I was taught was this, and allow them to kind of process that and think about that.
Yeah, and that I'll say the benefit of a conversational, engaging style of a Lean 101 allows you to meet the student where they are.
Yeah.
Right. Without too much pre-work, without too much assumption that you build into it. The downside is that depending on who's delivering it, it can, you certainly lose some of the consistency unless you really prepare the instructors around those talking points.
And there's a difference where when I was talking with this woman, it was basically a one-on-one conversation. It could be completely tailored to her individual knowledge and needs. When you're in a room of people, I think the biggest challenge is when you have a room of people with a wide range of previous knowledge or experience. Now, like, do you go in the middle where you might be overwhelming people who don't know anything, and you might be boring the people who already know something? Maybe they shouldn't be in the Lean 101 class.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is around what is the investment, right? So, if it was, say, a 90-minute training or event or whatever you want to call it, I kind of feel like, okay, if you're going to be bored for an hour and a half, so be it. Like you should hear the same things that other people are hearing just because it'll help the conversations that come after that. And you can see where they are and you can help them and you can be part of the process and you can build on it. If it's a day, if it's more than a day and they're going to be bored, that's a bigger question. I mean, somebody says, hey, would you want to sit in on a one-day Lean 101 training just to give us some feedback? I'd have to think long and hard about whether I'd want to do that.
I don't know if I would want to spend a day in a whiskey 101 class unless there was a lot of tasting, because I feel like I've progressed beyond whiskey 101.
Yeah, I probably haven't, so I probably would learn more. I'm still not sure I want to sit there without a tasting talking about whiskey for 8 hours.
Maybe we need to combine Lean 101 training with whiskey. That's a limited market for that, I bet.
That is a limited market. Yeah. I think there's some general counsels that might put the kibosh on that particular decision. But it would be interesting. I actually gave a speech today. Speaking of, my whiteboarding, digital whiteboarding gave a speech today to an evening audience in the Middle East, and it was. It was a good conversation and good moment, but an evening intro to Lean course might go a little differently than a lunch and learn.
Yeah, but your blog post, and we'll link to this in the show notes. I don't know if it was intended to be provocative. The title was skip the Lean intro training. I think with a question mark. Right?
Yeah, and I think it wasn't meant to be just provocative. It was meant to suggest that I think a lot of organizations could do without it. Because, here's my argument against doing it at all. And I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying if you're going to do Lean 101, know what comes after. Know what comes next. And if there's a clear plan, if there's a roadmap, if there's a strategy behind how you're going to teach people, then do they need intro to Lean, or do they need the first tool, capability, or method you're going to ask them to use?
Right.
And then you build on it, right? So you don't learn, we're both engineers by education. We don't get to do a lot of that anymore. Yeah. But, we've never been taught the history of scientific thinking.
No.
Right?
No.
The history of engineering. Right, we learned math and mechanics, right? Because that was step one, and physics, and then we learned the next capability, and then we did more integrative capabilities, right? And there was a progression to that learning where we didn't even have to know where we were headed. We had to kind of have some line of sight, but fundamentally it was we're going to give you some building blocks, and you're going to use them. Then we're going to give you some more integrative capabilities, and you're going to use those. And then we're going to teach you to think for yourself. You're going to use that.
Yeah.
But we didn't really need an intro course there, right?
Yeah.
And you look at most disciplines that you start with some core capabilities, and you build on that, and you build on that, and build on that. And so that's really my argument, is that I think lean can be taught the same way.
I mean, I think at the same time, a lot of it's very situational. What challenges does this organization face? There are some people. There's all kinds of dogma out there, right? There's one school of thought that says, don't do training. You learn by doing lots and lots of Kaizen events, and that's the only mode or model that they're using. There's something to be said for learning by doing with an experienced coach. There's going to introduce the right tool, just in time training, if you will. I think there's a lean lesson there.
Yep.
Back to when I think we went through similar program in the day. It was TQM, Total Quality Management at MIT, and they would talk about what learn, do, learn, do, learn, do.
Yep.
I think there's a lean principle maybe that's helpful around smaller batches.
Right.
Of learn and go and try and get feedback and get experience. But back to like what do you start with? I would argue that's situational. There's dogma. We've all heard it that says you always start with 5S.
Right.
I've seen situations where starting with kind of simple PDSA Kaizen is a great place to get started. You're teaching people problem solving.
Exactly.
And then at some point they may run into a problem where 5S is a very helpful countermeasure, and let's learn about that a little bit, and then let's go do. And let's keep going.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of it does depend on how much control you have over such a roadmap, right? So going back to our engineering education, the university had a lot of control over that. What's required, what's an elective, what's optional, right? Lots and lots of control over ensuring you got the pieces. So I think one of the factors filters people put on making the decision around, do I have lean, intro to lean, and what's included if I don't, is probably comes from a fear of lack of that control, right? Meaning that, hey, if I could lay out the next 3 years of your education, then I'm gonna feed it to you a piece at a time, just in time. But I don't have confidence that that's how it's going to go. So I'm going to give you something while I have the chance.
But it seems like a college setting is much more controlled and deterministic. And when you think of a 3-year roadmap for an organization, the younger people listening, if there are younger people listening, they're going to say, what's a roadmap?
They might, yes.
And who knows what, like especially in healthcare, like a 3-year roadmap for an organization, there are so many things that could change in the next 3 years. Or let's rewind 3 years.
Yeah.
There was a pandemic. There was a change in administrations. There are all these different things that are hard to predict. I'll give credit to Ryan McCormick, good lean guy I know up in Winnipeg. He might be listening. I'll give him credit because I heard the idea from him. He would probably give credit to somebody else. Instead of thinking of a roadmap, think of GPS. You used GPS to drive here today. It had a plan, but if it's a good GPS, depending on traffic changes, it may reroute you. And I've been really fascinated with that idea recently we still use the language, I think, of a lean roadmap, but what if we thought, this is getting off the topic of Lean 101, but if we're thinking of lean GPS, that might influence our thoughts on how much can we really predict the sequence of what we need to teach.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Of course, it requires us, I'll say, coding the algorithm, right?
Yeah.
Mapping the terrain. We know much more about our roadways than we do about how to successfully navigate an organization's transformation. And I think that's, 3 years is a long time, right? Lots of things can change. And if you're doing Lean 101, then you probably don't know as much about the 3-year commitment to the journey itself. And so I think there is a tendency to say, hey, I've got him for whatever time I've got him. I'm going to give him everything I can. And that I think leads to what I think is the biggest mistake of intro to lean training, is just trying to cram too much into the bag.
Yeah.
Whether it's an hour and a half or 3 or 8 hours.
Yeah, and I think there's a temptation, especially with people who have less experience. They're excited, and they want to share everything that they've learned that's made an impact to them, right? So I think a lot of it comes from a good place. of like, I'm excited, I know these things, I want to share them with you, but it runs the risk of overwhelming people. Or giving, I think there's this question around, batch size of learning. How much can people really absorb before you need to say, okay, let's stop and let's go do something and apply what we've learned. And I think there's the other challenge, and it's a speaker trap of, we've all heard a presenter at a conference who says, this is normally a full day workshop, but I've only got 45 minutes. And they're literally trying to cram a day's. Don't do that. Don't cram a full day into 45 minutes.
Yeah. And I would say, I definitely used to be that way. I'd want it, whether it was ego and I wanted to show how much I knew, or it was passion and I wanted to share how much I learned. Right, there's little nuggets like you probably read Michael Cusimano's book on the Japanese automotive history.
Long time ago,
yeah, and it was his PhD dissertation on Japanese studies, and it wasn't really a lean book, but you still want to study it, and you go back to the history of arranged marriages and banks and all these things that had an influence on Toyota in the early days and. Well, that's knowledge that not everybody has, but it's interesting, and I want to share it and tell that story. But that's probably not the filter that the student's looking at it through.
Yeah, I mean, can we teach principles of built-in quality and error proofing without talking about weaving looms? Probably. I think there's one other dimension of like thinking of fitness for use. Lean 101 training in an organization that's brand new to Lean versus one that's years into the journey. You're going to have new employees, new leaders. You want to give them that Lean 101, if you will. It's probably all the better if you're drawing on examples from your own organization. So people aren't tempted to say, but we don't make weaving looms and we're not Japanese or we're not manufacturers. I think when you can say, you can point to here are principles and methods, and here's how it's actually been applied here. That's probably, when you can do that, more beneficial than pointing to other companies, other industries, or even other centuries.
Yeah, other centuries, right? Exactly. And I think that is a big factor in what should be in the content, which is interesting because I don't see a lot of organizations that refresh their Lean 101 training as much as they should. But if you are mature, you're really preparing somebody, for what they're going to see in the organization that's already there, right? Here's why we do what we do in the way that we do it. Yeah. If you're new to the journey, you're mostly trying to answer the question why, right? Why us? Why now? Why this? Yeah. And to me, that's a whether it's history or data or benchmarking or logic, right? You do want to build some credibility into what you're trying to do, but you also at the same time want to answer, why are we doing this, right? What's relevant for our organization at this time, which I think is important, because if this is important, why didn't we do it last year or the year before? And that's why I always like, it's not just why, it's why now.
Right.
Right. What is special about now? Maybe we're finally just convinced ourselves, and that's the best answer we have. That's fine. Yeah. But why not last year? Why not 5 years ago? Why not 5 years in the future?
Yeah. So I think I'm just thinking of another example. There's a difference between Lean 101, new people into an organization. I'm going to teach you the history of Hoshin Conry. Okay, that. When I talk about Hewlett Packard and other, because I think part of the history was Hewlett Packard Japan. It wasn't even necessarily Toyota or other usual suspects. But then I think there's a difference between saying, well, here's a history of Hoshin Conry. Let me teach you in general what an X matrix is versus pulling up, here's our current X matrix.
Right.
And so now I'm teaching you about the current state of the business and some of the plans and objectives, and I'm going to teach you how an X matrix works, which I think when I joined Honeywell in 2004, the director I worked for was a former Danaher guy who was all about the X matrix, and he tried going through all that for all that purpose, and I still felt like my head was going to explode from turning my head and rotating the paper so much and piecing it together. But I think when you can make it really, really practical, that's going to resonate with people and answer the question of like, why should I be paying attention to this? Why should I be committing any of this to memory?
Right. Yeah, and that's, I think expectations should be clear. What's next should be clear. I am reminded of there's an episode of The Big Bang Theory where Penny wants to know what Leonard does and goes to Sheldon for help, and he makes her take out a notebook, and he's like, "What is physics?" And it was a starry night, and so he goes into this spiel, and she's like, "I just want to know what Leonard does." Yeah, right. So it is what question are we trying to answer, and in the end, right? People. What is lean? Well, it's a way to get better, right? So if we want to really make it simple, and that's why my bias was always towards if somebody gave me an hour, I'd want to spend at least a third of that time, if not half or more, giving them something practical that they can do like that day.
Yeah.
Right? Because if I'm going to just spend an hour talking about just lean stuff, like, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do this afternoon with what I just gave you? Unless I give you something you can do immediately and put it to use, and then maybe you're curious about more. But if the only outcome of an hour teach is I need another hour teach, well, okay, right. I'm not sure that then we should have just asked for the 2 hours to begin with.
Yeah. So how much time do you spend? You should spend some time on something actionable, learn and do and go and try. How much time do you devote to setting the context of why? Because you might have an organization that already thinks it's really a high-performing organization or better than most, and setting that context of what the motivation is. If you're brought in as an outsider, why were you even brought in? If an organization is new to lean, what's their hypothesis on why this is going to be helpful? Or if the organization is down the path and this is training for new employees, to articulate the why in terms of the benefits, not just hypotheses, but here's our experience. Mm-hmm. We've improved safety by this much. We've improved quality by this much. We've improved on-time delivery by this much. And here's how that flows through. We're a stronger, better business as a result. That's, I think, more impactful than this like theoretical exercise.
Right.
There's also another question I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on. Toyota would frame the Toyota Production System as technical methods or tools, management approach, philosophy. Like if you had an hour to teach Lean 101, you probably don't want to spend an hour on philosophy, even though the philosophy is really important, right?
Yep. Yeah, and so that is, there's always time and a place to build on what you've done. So I like to work backwards from what are they going to do coming out of this?
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes it is, well, they're going to sign up for 3-day class. Okay, fine. If that's the next step, then let's all we have to do is pique their curiosity in a way that sets up they go sign up for a 3-day class. Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm totally okay with that. But you still want to answer that question. What do they do next? And if you don't have an answer, right? I mean, mm-hmm. if you don't. If there is no next, if it's like this is the only shot, that's the tough design situation. That's where I have some sympathy for folks where it's like, hey, I've been asked to do this training. We don't have a roadmap. We don't have the resources. We have this one shot. How do I get? And this is the key, right? It's like they ask, how do I get everything across that we need to get across? It's like it's probably not gonna fly. How do you set them up for success with something, and then I'll say hope the rest takes care of itself later mm-hmm. on.
I think there's another good lean principle there of customer focus. Mm-hmm. The customer of the training, like you said, working backward from what they need to accomplish. I always think back to Taiichi Ohno in his book on the Toyota Production System. There's a chapter where the header just says start from need, and then later on he says start from your most pressing needs. Mm-hmm. At least how that was translated, and assuming that's accurate, I think that's compelling. Thinking about what people need. I think another trap, whether it's training or a presentation, is thinking my job is to get through all the slides.
Right.
Like to an opposite, I've often set up when I've done different training, whether it was lean training or Kaizen, continuous improvement training, or stuff based on my book Measures of Success and process behavior charts. A lot of times I will say up front, I do not see my job here. I do not define success as getting through all my slides in the sequence that I predicted was going to be correct. So there's always, I think, this need for adjustments based on the questions people are asking. So, okay, well, that's a great question. Let's go ahead and let's jump ahead and touch on a different lean concept. That wasn't the sequence I planned on going through, but I think there is no one right sequence. I think this is the challenge in building a class or even writing a book. In what sequence do I introduce these ideas? There might not be one right way.
No, because quite frankly, if they weren't integral to each other, you wouldn't put them in the same course, right? I mean, if they were completely disconnected, independent thoughts, right?
Yeah.
Here's two parts of the class, and they're unrelated to each other. Well, then there should be two courses, right? The fact is they're integrated, they overlap, they feed each other, and it's not, and generally not in a linear way. So I don't think there's a right way. But at the same time, you have to understand your course design enough to know, what destroys the integrity of the flow of the course, because there is, at least in how it's designed, there should be an internal logic behind it. And if you don't understand why that design is the way that it is, then you don't know where you can deviate and where you can't, right? It's just like a detour on a GPS, right? If you have a roadmap, you kind of go, okay, here's where I can detour and here's where I can't detour, where GPS maybe solves that problem for you.
Yeah. And so thinking about GPS, I'm thinking about driving. I mean, the thing about Lean or the Toyota Production System is a system. It's hard to describe this interconnected system in a linear way. Where I think if you're teaching somebody to drive, you probably could break down the most important things to teach first are the difference. I don't know. First, do you teach them the difference between park, reverse, neutral, and drive? And then once they know that, I don't know, what's the next most important thing? Accelerator versus brake? And if it's electric car, the whole gear shift thing. And I almost say gas pedal. Another outdated term, kind of like roadmap for some people. But
well, then there's clutch, so we won't even go there.
Right. Because you drive a stick shift still, right? Just
not currently.
Not currently.
And if I had a bigger driveway or a bigger garage, I'd have something that's a stick in there. But currently without an automatic or without a manual.
So here I'll build on the parallel maybe. Driving 101 course for 15-year-olds trying to get their learner's permit probably does not need to include a segment on the history of the automobile.
Right.
It probably doesn't require a segment on the history of driving laws. What I care about is what are the laws today.
And
right?
why. And why.
And
right?
why.
And that's where that's the tricky part sometimes, but and the why.
Yeah. But if most, I imagine, I think even when I was learning how to drive in the late 80s, I'm sure the class assumed that everybody was going to be driving an automatic transmission car. I don't remember any, like if you were going to have to drive a stick shift, and when I've learned, my dad is a GM executive, would often have different company cars or loaner cars that he could get. And so oh gosh, this must have been frustrating for him trying to teach me. It was him teaching me how to drive a stick shift, not a driving school instructor.
Right. No, and I learned how to drive a stick shift after I bought one. I bought one. It was parked on a hill, and then I had to, and I had to learn how to drive a stick shift.
So your hypothesis was I could figure this out.
My hypothesis was I could figure this out.
Did you burn out the clutch?
I did not.
Okay.
No. I mean, eventually I did because I bought a used car and it was already partway there. But
some teenager had abused it, maybe.
It had gotten some work, but it also just had some age. It was was a 1984. So
What was it though?
it was a CJ7. Jeep CJ7.
Jeep CJ7.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
My first car was a 1984 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme.
yeah.
Automatic.
Yeah, so this wasn't my first car, but it was my first manual car.
Yeah.
So let me. This is a complete side note, but it's just since this is about us, right?
Sure.
We've had a discussion recently about driver's education in schools and whether you get to drive a car or you just learn about stuff. So I got to drive as part of driver's education delivered by the school, and we drove an AMC Eagle.
Wow.
Yeah, which is not a good car.
There's no risk of going too fast.
No risk of going too fast. No, none at all. Or being seen as cool, right? I mean, you can't be cool in an AMC Eagle.
Yeah.
So did you have driver education with a car? And if so, what was that car?
I don't remember. It was actually not through the school district. And I remember growing up when I was young in Ohio, one of my dad's uncles was a phys ed teacher who also taught driver's ed. And I remember hearing about this, and I don't know why this stuck with me. But when I took driver's ed, it was actually through the YMCA in our city. I don't think the school district
Interesting.
did formal driver's education. Or if they did, I don't know. Maybe it was only in the summertime. I don't remember the context. But no, it wasn't through the school district. But I think it's another point that comes back to lean training. Driver's education was not just a classroom experience.
Right.
I could not get certified as a whatever color driver belt. I guess it would be a seat belt. But yeah, I'm a driving yellow belt without ever having driven a car.
Yes, which is interesting, right? So that is the application orientation of learning, right? I was going to say training, but learning lean is there's an application element. It's interesting because my middle son got his driver's license during the pandemic, and the of course you're supposed to go on a road course, right? You have an instructor or an evaluator in the car with you, but they couldn't do that.
Yeah.
So they basically the test was make sure you can parallel park in the parking lot, and you kind of passed.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious if there's going to be any data that suggests that the people we passed with their driver's test during the pandemic without a full road test end up with a higher accident rate. Now, fortunately, my son's very, very, very good driver, very cautious driver.
I'm sure you're supervising him.
And enough.
You're giving him the road education.
Yeah, we are, but he also took to it naturally, so we wasn't worried.
This was not in the episode plan, but this is how these things go. But extending on the driving analogy to lean training, there's always something to learn, right? So I got my learner's permit. That's a good phrase. Does anyone get a learner's permit from their organization? You are authorized.
Authorized to learn more about lean.
Authorized to learn more and go practice. But so I got my driver's license. Then let's see in what sequence. When I turned 30, my wife and I were living in Phoenix, and you might know the name, Jamie, Bob Bondurant, race car driver, and he had a school. The Bob Bondurant driving school, which no longer exists. I think that was even going back to before the pandemic, and Bob Bondurant might have passed away. But this was a driving class where they had an oval track and they had a road track, and you were out there with race car instructors, and it was just a fun day out there in a Mustang and cruising around. It was a nice gift to me for my 30th birthday. I was really excited about it. But then being on kind of like, kind of a road track and on the oval, and you learn real, basics that would avoid trouble out on real roads. The idea of when you're approaching a curve, you brake when you're going straight. Mm-hmm. It's better to brake when you're going in a straight line than accelerate into the curve.
Right.
And I think the other idea is making sure you're looking far enough ahead down the road. And you're naturally going to steer to where you're looking, and there's this balance. If you don't want to be looking just right to the end of your hood, if you can see the hood, and not too far down the road. So there are lessons that I think that apply to everyday driving. I'm not trying to be racing around. But there are times if I'm on a curvy road, I'll remember brake in a straight line, accelerate out of the curve. And then when I worked for Johnson & Johnson, as a consultant, we were technically part of the sales organization, and we were given company car fleet vehicles. And they realized, I'll give J&J credit, the most dangerous thing any of us could have done as white-collar employees was driving. And the more you're out on the road, the more dangerous it was. So a condition of having that company vehicle, which was a nice perk, was to go through a driving course. And you would have to do it every 3 years. So I actually went through that twice. It was out in the parking lot of a Texas high school stadium, and they set up a thing and different exercises. And you were learning through practice. Of learning how to do evasive lane changes. And the final thing I'll add as a punchline to the story. You're like, why am I learning this? Okay, hit the brakes, go over a lane, and stop. When am I going to use? I'm like, okay, this is kind of cool. I'm kind of beating up on the company car a little bit. But I was driving in an official J&J capacity from Midland, Texas, back home in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It was at night. I'm driving in the left lane of the interstate. And I'm driving along, and suddenly I hear this bang, and my windshield is shattered. I'm not worried about root cause yet. We figured out eventually what happened, but I cannot see out of my windshield anymore. And so the muscle memory from that class kicked in. I remember looking in the rearview mirror, slamming on my brakes, going left onto the shoulder, stopped the car. I'm like, okay, whatever happened, I've survived it. And it turns out, they think from the other side of traffic, a semi-truck had hit a 4x4 that had apparently fallen off of somebody else's load, and this thing was flying at my windshield like a javelin.
Jeez.
And shattered the windshield. And final thought to the story. So I'm appreciative that driving training may very well have saved my life. That I didn't go into the ditch, I didn't flip the car, And then every first responder from a couple different jurisdictions, because this was out in the country, they all asked, how'd you get that stopped on the shoulder so perfectly? And I'm like, thankfully my company invested in safe driving training. So I'm thankful that wasn't just, my gosh, an online course on safe driving.
Well, so this is why I always like to distinguish lean learning from lean training, right? To me, lean learning, may or may not include lean training, right? But it certainly includes practice, and it probably includes coaching.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, hopefully.
Because as you use the word muscle memory, right? I mean, when we talk about just problem solving as one element. Right. Well, just the instinct or intuition of, when do I expand my problem and look bigger, and when do I focus it and narrow down, and when do I know enough about current reality, and when do I need to study it harder? That comes with that muscle memory, and it requires repetition and practice and coaching. So that's why I really harp on the term lean learning, because it's like, okay, well, how are you going to go about learning? And what are all those mechanisms? And training might be an input to that.
Right.
But when I ask an organization about their lean learning strategy, they will show me their lean training strategy. And they're not synonyms.
Right. It's possible to learn without training.
Yes.
Right. So there is we're going to learn by doing school of thought, whether that's, I would argue that shouldn't be only Kaizen events, but let's learn by doing. It's possible to learn without training. Unfortunately, it's also possible to sit through training without learning.
Yes.
And we've heard all kinds of situations, like in healthcare, people will complain about the electronic medical record system. They'll say it's hard to use. And let's say maybe the training was really dull and unengaging. And the organization says, well, we trained you without thinking of the lessons from, let's say, training within industry that a lot of our listeners might know of.
Right.
This idea that, you need to confirm that the knowledge was actually transferred and that it sunk in. You can't just assume, I talked at you, therefore you learned. You've got to kind of test that hypothesis that the training was effective.
And that leads me to a bias of mine that's shifted over time. And that is, I mean, I used to be a a strong advocate of simulation and case studies, and I still love those. Right, I think they're great, and I designed so many. I don't want to say so many simulations, I can't count them, but more than I can actually remember.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll recall. Oh yeah, I remember that now. But I to me, simulations is not. They make it fun. They help with some of the application, but they aren't real enough to really ensure that you know what you're talking about, right? And so, I don't do a lot of this. A lot of what I do now is more coaching, but I do some workshops, and I kind of insist that the application be real. Like, okay, even if we have to slow it down, even if we have to, give you more space or time, more coaching, whatever it's going to take, I would rather you try to do it for real, and then let's see if you got it and see what questions you have. Then do it in a simulation. We declare success, right?
Yeah.
And then you go off into the real world and struggle like hell.
Yeah.
And so to me, my bias has shifted. Now, again, I'm not running any workshops that are scaled across a large organization. This is just what I do with my time, and so I get to set different rules for that. But it is a reinforcement of the learning is what matters. There's many tools in the learning strategy, and training is a guarantee of nothing.
And you could maybe also say, I mean, the learning matters a lot, but then how much did the application and the results matter? Because I think of the last manufacturing company I worked for, was really proud of how many people they had put through Greenbelt training. I may have told this story before here. I know I've told it other places, but let's say they had trained and certified approximately 500 people. Okay, they had learned something, and better yet, it wasn't just classroom book knowledge. They all had to do a project that was mentored by a black belt. It was pretty rigorous. But then what? To what benefit? I do remember quite clearly if 500 people had gotten certified, the total number of green belt projects ever completed was something like 506. Because people got their certification and the organization was not encouraging more projects. It was not giving them time to do it. And so then you step back and say, well, okay, I'm sure there was some business benefit to those 500 projects. And thank goodness 6 of them figured out how to do a second project. Or maybe one person did 5 more projects. And then they may have left and become a Six Sigma consultant. But yeah, what a shame if people are not able to apply the learning in a way that strengthens and reinforces the learning and has benefit to the organization.
Yeah, and that really, really reinforces the point is you have to understand what's going to come after the training, right?
Yeah.
Is it a requirement for application? Is it coaching? Is it more training? Are they plugging into a mature system where it's naturally going to happen? Or are you just hoping it happens? Right. So you really have to understand what is true for the graduate, for the Lean 101 training recipient the minute after they leave.
I'm going to bring it back to driving and thinking about like purpose and what you're moving along for and what you're moving toward. We've probably all seen videos online of somebody driving a $200,000 supercar who drives it badly and wrecks it. That's probably not the first car you should ever learn how to drive on.
Right.
So how often with lean training are we asking people to drive a Ferrari before they've learned how to drive, it was the AMC Eagle?
The AMC Eagle.
Or an Oldsmobile Cutlass.
Right.
Or, there was, again, like that Cutlass, same thing. It was a big, huge, heavy car. There's no way I don't know if it exceeded the speed limit, even if it was 55 at the time. It was a chore. The car told you shouldn't be driving this fast.
Right. Yeah, it gave you some feedback. So I don't know if we've answered, the question, what should Lean 101 training look like? But I think we've concluded a few key points, right? You be user-centered, right? Yep. User-centric, design with the user in mind, understand where you are as an organization, understand where the student is as a student, set them up for what happens next, and don't design your training to be about sharing everything you know,
Right.
patting your ego, or believing that everybody needs to be as passionate as you do.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't expect that to happen immediately.
Right.
They're not going to come out of the book learning, classroom training with that passion. They may develop that passion once they go and do some really cool stuff
Right.
that they're proud of in action that makes the organization better. But I'm going to share one thought, and this is the point in the podcast where I feel like this could be the whiskey talking. But I had a thought. This may or may not be clever. So we probably all know the joke or the parable, or people post on social media. The CFO asks, "What happens if we train our people and they leave?" And then somebody, whoever the hero of the story, whatever their role might be, "What if we don't train them and they stay?" Okay, fair enough. Good point. But maybe there's a third possibility there. What if we train them and don't let them do anything with the training?
Yes.
Well, then they might leave. So maybe that's back to the first point. Or it's just a waste of money.
It might be.
Sorry.
No, but I do think that quote is credited to Zig Ziglar.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it is. We can
Right.
fact check that.
Yeah.
But I think that is an important question, which is what will be true when they're done. And I remember an organization that asked me to look at their lean training, and I was like, they were asking, well, is it good? I'm like, yeah, it's great. But what happens when they graduate from it? They're going to expect help, right? They're gonna want to go do stuff.
Yeah.
You've gotten them excited. They want to go do stuff, and you have like one coach. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's you have to be careful about spending too much time getting people excited about something and then telling them they can't use it the next day.
Or tell them to go use it without training, and it's the equivalent of running the car into a telephone pole.
Yeah.
They might not literally hurt themselves, but they might be scared off from ever trying again.
Certainly
with
could be
lean
frustrating.
if they had a bad experience or people got angry with them.
Yep.
Because let's say we taught them lean tools, but we never had a discussion about change management.
Yep. Exactly.
And they're a bull in the china shop, and they go out and do 5S2 people. And now they think, okay, well, we tried lean here and it didn't work as an individual or as a company.
Yep.
I think there's a real risk of that if we're not giving them that coaching and mentorship along the way.
Yeah. So don't launch a Lean 101 strategy without a full lean strategy, knowing what else you're sending people into as they come out of it. So key lesson learned.
Yes. And we're speaking from experience from having made some or all of these mistakes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll speak for myself. I've never actually, until I was, I'll say a consultant and observing other people's training, I didn't learn any of this through a classroom, right? I didn't take lean training. There wasn't.
Chrysler
really lean
wasn't
training.
doing Lean 101 training. You were just doing stuff.
I helped design it. Right? I helped put together Chrysler Operating System course number 1, right, and helped deliver that very first session with our Lego simulations where we built Jeeps. And so I drove around to Kmart's buying Jeep Lego kits to build out simulations. So yeah, there was nothing to go take. We were designing some of our first training. So yeah, we've along the way we've experienced many of these mistakes one way or the other, and we're behind many of them. So
Yeah.
okay, all right. Good topic.
Good topic. I'll be curious to hear listener feedback, or I'm curious what you think, Jamie. Is it easier? Is it better? Is this a better podcast doing it in person without the Zoom stuff in between?
Yeah, we'll see. Obviously, we didn't video record this, so for anybody that's used to watching on YouTube, they'll just miss out on this this episode, and that's too bad. But curious. But again, we've said this before. We do this kind of for us, and we hope our listeners like it too.
Yeah.
So this was definitely good for me.
Yeah.
Just a chance to be in person again for the first time in quite a while.
Yeah.
So
To be across the table, I can't resize your head by clicking and dragging on the window.
no.
Not saying your head needs to be resized. But
No.
Just
We also can't mute each other. Can't do that either.
I'm looking at notes on my iPad. I'm also not being distracted by my iPhone or anything else that's beeping or there on a computer. So
nothing else other than getting here and getting home. So
yeah, and so we'll end with as we normally do, closing fun question, Philadelphia version maybe. You've probably been here a lot, Jamie. What would you say is the best thing or something that's really cool about Philadelphia?
Yeah, so and I don't get here as often as I should, as close as it is, and that's not just a pandemic story. That's that's a perpetual story.
Busy family story.
Busy family, my own travel, at least in the past, and you kind of if you're going to drive an hour and a half into the city, and you need a plan, right? Mm-hmm. So, but to me, the history of the city, as it reflects in some of its monuments, but also some of its museums, is tremendous. Even some of the lesser known museums where you get around and get connected to the history are fantastic. It obviously had a huge part of the founding of our country.
Yeah.
And even the Franklin, of course, Benjamin Franklin, the scientific museum, the Franklin Institute, I think it's called, is super cool museum.
Yeah.
Really, really neat. It has nothing to do with the Revolutionary War, but it does have to do with, Benjamin Franklin, where it gets its name. So I do think I don't spend a lot of time going to museums, but I do always appreciate when I do. And the museum scene here is pretty solid.
I need to figure out a way to check that out because I'm busy with a client during the day. There is so much history here. I was staying a different hotel in my first couple of weeks here. In between that hotel and the hospital, I was quite literally walking past the Liberty Bell in Independence Hall every single day.
Yeah.
And that's very cool to see. Walking back so I've gotten to explore restaurants after work. It's a great food city here. But then walking back from a restaurant and walking past the Liberty Bell at night, and you can see it through glass from the sidewalk and the way it's lit and the way it's situated. It was very cool. And when I was a kid, I remember visiting the Liberty Bell. I believe it was under just a covering structure and pretty much exposed to the elements. And I think at some point through a restoration and through some fundraising, they realized we should probably protect it a little bit better. From the weather or crazy people or what have you. But that's really unique. And then I also love the little details. In fact, I posted a picture on Instagram this morning. Given the chance, I will kind of weave my way through the different little side streets instead of taking the more direct route to the hospital because it reminds me of Boston. There are some of these little, I call them tiny streets.
Right.
Where you could not drive a car down them.
Right.
The homes are separated by a path wide enough maybe for a horse. And, these old historic homes that date back a couple hundred years and between the architecture and the streets, I'm enjoying that. And then, it is a really good food city. So if you love sushi, the original flagship Morimoto sushi restaurant, Japanese restaurant, is actually here in Philadelphia, which surprised me. I'd eaten at the one in New York City, and Chef Morimoto actually started here. And then Jamie and I, tonight after the podcast here, we're going to a place I really like. It's more of a modern Japanese, I call it Japanese style restaurant. It's a little bit more, fusion-y or just kind of they want to take a place called Double Knot that I like a lot. So between that and there's a restaurant here called Zahav, Israeli restaurant, Israeli chef, Middle Eastern food, has been on the #1 restaurant in the country list at least a couple of times.
Yes.
And when I was working here in 2019, I was able to get out of work early enough to go stand in line because you can't get a reservation there.
Okay.
But if you show up early enough, they've got some limited seating. And somebody here, a local, told me Philadelphia has more restaurants per capita than New York City.
Huh. Did not know that.
There are some really good, interesting restaurants here.
Now, another place you can't get a reservation is Geno's and Pat's. That's just because you stand in line and get a cheesesteak. But
yeah.
But yes, it's and unfortunately, I've never really experienced the food scene here quite a bit because when I would come down, it would usually be either for a morning meeting or with family, and we're generally not out exploring the higher end restaurants.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that's pretty neat to know some of that. I never knew it had. I knew it had good restaurants, and never knew it had more restaurants
Yeah.
per capita.
So I'm getting my restaurants, but thankfully my hotel is about a 20-minute walk from the hospital. So the one thing I love about having a client in a city like this is not needing a rental car.
Yeah,
And I can walk, and if the weather's bad, I'll take an Uber.
yeah, not bad at all. Fantastic. So yeah, a chance to be together in person.
Yeah.
Chance to try some one-off Garrison Brothers special edition. Chance to talk Lean 101. So cheers to all of that.
Cheers to that.
And yeah, so if you want to follow us and make sure you pay attention to the podcast, you can always find more. As I said, this is episode 33. So you can go to leanwhiskey.com, spelled either K-E-Y or K-Y. Either version is fine. You can find us at jflinch.com/leanwhiskey, or for Mark.
You can, and the leanwhiskey.com, I feel like this is selfish of me. I'm hogging the URL. The leanwhiskey.com URL forwards to leanblog.org/leanwhiskey. But if this is your first time listening and you're listening, let's say through either of our websites, you can find us, you can subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, kind of all the usual places you might find a podcast.
Yeah, so give us a listen, share with your friends, give us some feedback, and let us know what you think. Ask us questions, things that you'd like to hear us talk about in future episodes, and always looking for fresh ideas. And so we appreciate everyone, and to getting together. Cheers.
Cheers. Let's see what it sounds like to clink a glass in person.
In person.
We'll see whose microphone picked that up. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.